The hiss of my oxygen line was steady, until my son unplugged it. Still, I didn't open my eyes. Just curled one trembling finger around the recorder beneath my pillow. As the silence thickened, the missing air scraped at my throat like betrayal turned physical. While my lungs burned, I remembered the years I spent keeping him alive through every mistake he made. The same boy I once held through fevers now stood waiting for my last breath. That's when I pressed record, so the world would finally hear whose breath ended whose. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Joan lay still, the quiet hum of the oxygen machine the only sound in the room. It was a fragile comfort, a lifeline she had come to depend on over the past few years. The subtle rhythm of her shallow breathing barely disturbed the air. She wasn't fully asleep, but the drowsy haze of painkillers and fatigue kept her from fully alertness. The creak of floorboards in the hallway broke the silence. Joan's senses sharpened in an instant, a kind of survival instinct kicking in. She knew that sound too well. Marcus. He'd been pacing like that for the past few days, the sound of his restless footsteps always filling the house with tension. She listened, each step growing more deliberate, as though he was measuring the distance between them, assessing the space in her room with a kind of cold calculation. Then, without warning, there was a soft click. The unmistakable sound of her oxygen line being disconnected. Joan's heart stuttered, a jolt of panic coursing through her veins. A whisper. Last breath. Mom. She could feel the words curling into her skin like ice, as if he was carving them into her bones. But Joan's eyes stayed closed, her breaths shallow and measured. Her fingers twitched, reaching for the device hidden in the folds of her blanket. The recorder. Glenn had installed it just days before. It was tucked beneath her pillow, the button easy to find with practiced precision. She tightened her grip around it, fingers trembling just slightly as she pressed the record button. The small click of the device was almost imperceptible, but to Joan, it was the sound of something more, an act of resistance, a step toward justice. Her breath was growing labored now, the oxygen deprivation creeping in as her body struggled for air. It was like being trapped in a vacuum, each gasp weaker than the last. But Joan kept her eyes shut, still pretending to be asleep, the steady hum of the oxygen machine replaced by the desperate rasp of her own lungs fighting for life. Marcus lingered for a moment, the weight of his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. Joan could hear his slow, deliberate steps moving away. She didn't dare move a muscle. Not yet. He walked out of the room, his steps growing fainter, leaving Joan in the suffocating silence. Her fingers, though unsteady, found the line. She could feel the sharp cold of the metal against her skin. With a trembling hand, she plugged herself back in. The oxygen hissed back to life, a sound that felt like salvation. Joan's lungs expanded in a desperate, gasping breath. She sucked in air, her chest rising with the relief of life being restored to her. The recorder clicked again, and she hit stop. Her heartbeat, still erratic, began to slow as she sank back into the bed, the weight of what had just happened pressing heavily on her. Marcus had done it again. He'd tried to take her life, this time in the coldest, most calculating way. Joan's fingers remained on the recorder, her knuckles white. It was the second time now. The second time he'd tried. She wasn't sure what made her move slower than before, the weariness of age or the clarity of this moment. But it didn't matter. She'd survived. Again. But the recorder was still in her hand, still warm with the evidence of what he'd done, what he thought he could get away with. Joan's lips barely moved, but the words that came next were clear in her mind. I'm still breathing, Marcus. You won't have the last word. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:17 a.m. She had to act fast. The next move would be crucial. and as the room settled back into stillness, Joan's mind raced, plotting every step ahead. This time, she was ready. She had the proof. The recorder would speak for her. A cold, bitter smile touched her lips, and then the phone buzzed. A text. From Claire. "Got eyes. Let him move." Joan sat up slowly, the sheets tangled around her legs, her hand still resting on the recorder. The stillness of the room felt heavier now, like it had been pressed in by the weight of her own thoughts. The quiet air seemed to hum with the echo of Marcus's whispered words. "Last breath, Mom." Her lungs, grateful for the oxygen, expanded with a slow, deliberate inhale. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the bedside table. The recorder was warm to the touch, still carrying the faint imprint of Marcus's final action. Joan glanced at the clock. 2:23 a.m. Time to act. With practiced ease, she plugged the recorder into her laptop. The clicking sound of the keys filled the room as Joan opened the file, her eyes narrowing in focused concentration. She clicked through to the audio file, playing it back one last time. Marcus's voice, so cold, so sure of himself, it made her blood run cold. The file ended with the sound of her own frantic breaths, the relief of oxygen filling her lungs. But it was more than just a breath. It was the evidence. It was survival. She quickly copied the recording to a backup flash drive. The small device clicked as it locked into place, a solid, unmistakable form of insurance. Joan typed a brief note to Glenn. He was always the first person she trusted in moments like this, the one person who wouldn't question her decisions. She didn't need to be reminded of the importance of what she was doing. It was already clear in her mind. She wrote the note with careful precision. Insurance, just in case. The words felt hollow in the quiet room, but they were true. Every decision she had made so far, every step she had taken, had been in preparation for this moment. Joan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, clicking through the last file and then closing her laptop with a soft snap. She opened the drawer of the nightstand and took out her medical journal. The journal was a record of her life. Each day was logged in meticulous detail. The time of her oxygen treatments, the temperature, the fluctuations in her condition. It was part of her routine, but now she had to add something else. Joan grabbed the pen and slowly wrote the time, the temperature in her room, the day's date. And then, below the line, she wrote, "Attempted murder, Marcus Huxley, 2:17 a.m." She shut the journal with a deliberate snap, the pages thick with years of her life, and tucked it back into the drawer. There was no emotion in the act, just methodical precision. As she stood up, her knees groaned in protest, the ache of age making itself known with every step. She moved carefully, deliberately, as if the weight of the world was balanced on her frail shoulders. The house was silent, but she could feel the presence of the others. Marcus, Lana. They would be in the house somewhere, pretending not to notice her, pretending that everything was fine. But Joan knew better. Lana's voice reached her first as she shuffled into the kitchen. "You look better today," Lana said, her tone clipped, feigning kindness. Joan didn't look up. She didn't have to. "Looks can be deceiving," she replied, her voice steady, a quiet certainty in her words. Lana paused for a beat, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but she didn't push. She just moved past Joan, her footsteps hurried. Joan watched her go, her mind ticking like a clock. She didn't need Lana's approval. Lana was part of the game now. They all were. She moved to the pantry, opening a drawer and pulling out the small rusted tin. The peanut tin, the one she had found in the back of a cupboard last week. It had always been there, a forgotten relic from years ago. But now it served a new purpose. She opened it slowly, the metal lid creaking as it lifted, and placed the flash drive inside. It fit perfectly. She sealed the tin, the weight of it grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. Joan tucked the tin back behind the shelves, out of sight, but close enough that she knew exactly where it was. The plan was set. The pieces were in motion. Joan sank back into her chair with a soft sigh, her fingers resting on the cool surface of the table. She could hear Marcus's footsteps in the hallway, his anger simmering beneath the surface. But it didn't matter anymore. Not when she had the recording. Not when she had the truth. The house was quiet, but Joan knew the storm was coming, and this time, she was ready. As the days stretched on, Joan's thoughts turned to Claire. She needed to move fast, but she knew that Claire would understand. Claire was already in the game. She just needed the right moment. Joan's fingers curled tightly around the tin, the weight of it steadying her. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. Then, a noise from the front door. Shuffling, like footsteps on the porch. Joan's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes darted toward the window. She didn't need to check the time. It was coming. The reckoning. The afternoon light stretched long through the window, casting a soft amber glow across Joan's kitchen. The quiet was thick, the air still, and the only sound was the faint hum of her oxygen machine, a soft reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still in control. She had done what needed to be done. The plan was in motion. The flash drive was tucked away, secure, just waiting for the right moment. But now, it was time to make the call. Her fingers hovered over the phone, the sleek surface cool under her fingertips. She had thought long and hard about who to trust, who to call. It had to be someone who wouldn't doubt her. Someone who could see through the quiet, the subtle game that was playing out in the shadows. She dialed Claire Rennick's number with a practiced hand. The line rang, steady, filling the space between her thoughts. Joan wasn't sure what she expected, but it certainly wasn't the sudden clarity of her own voice leaving a message. It came out in a steady, calm tone, so much so that it almost sounded rehearsed. "It's Joan Huxley. I need you to hear something." The click of the voicemail sounded too final. She wasn't waiting for Claire's answer. She had already made up her mind. Joan hung up and sat back in her chair, the weight of the silence pressing in once again. But there was something comforting about it this time. Something in the stillness told her that the ball was rolling, even if she couldn't see it yet. By the time evening settled in, the house felt different, more like a waiting room, as if something unspeakable were about to happen. Joan moved through the quiet, methodical. She had nothing left to do but wait. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:03 p.m., a sharp chime that cut through the low murmur of the evening. Joan's heart skipped, and her hand tightened around the arm of her chair. She knew it was Claire before she even stood up to answer the door. Joan opened it to find Officer Claire Rennick standing on the porch, her hands tucked in the pockets of her jacket. She looked different in civilian clothes, more relaxed than when she'd been in uniform at dispatch all those years ago, but there was no mistaking her. Joan had always trusted Claire's steady eyes, her measured responses. She had been a trainee when Joan worked dispatch, and Joan had always respected the way Claire listened before reacting. Claire's lips parted, and she nodded in recognition. "Joan," she said softly, "you said you needed me to hear something." Joan stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. She didn't need to say more. Claire had already known something was coming. Claire set down her notepad as she walked into the living room, her gaze sweeping over the small space. Joan could see the flicker of recognition in Claire's eyes, but she didn't comment. She didn't need to. The tension in the air was already thick enough. "Have a seat," Joan murmured, motioning to the chair opposite hers. Claire complied, sitting down with a quiet rustle of fabric. Joan moved over to the side table and, without ceremony, placed the recorder on the wooden surface, the small device almost invisible among the clutter of papers and medication bottles. Joan's fingers hovered over the play button, her skin feeling tight, stretched thin by the weight of what she was about to do. She pressed it. The room filled with Marcus's voice, cold and dark, like a wound that wouldn't heal. "Last breath, Mom." Joan's chest tightened at the sound, but she didn't flinch. She knew what was coming. She had to. The recording played on, and Claire sat still, her eyes fixed on Joan as the words washed over them both. There was no hesitation in Claire's expression, not even the slightest sign of disbelief. She simply listened, letting the words sink in. The low rasp of Joan's breath at the end. The sharp intake of air as the oxygen returned. Claire's eyes darkened. She set her notepad down, a small but deliberate motion. "That's attempted murder," she said, her voice low but certain. Joan nodded, her fingers still resting lightly on the recorder. "That's Tuesday." The words landed in the room with the weight of finality. Claire's gaze flickered toward Joan for a moment, her jaw tightening. Joan could see the wheels turning in her mind, calculating, processing, shifting from disbelief to action. Joan didn't wait for her to speak. "You believe me now," she said softly, her voice steady, unwavering. "I need you to act. Not just for me, for everyone else he's hurt." Claire didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The gravity of the situation was clear. She'd been through her share of cases, but this one was different. Personal, in a way. Joan was no longer the dispatcher, a voice on the other end of the line. She was real. She was here. And this was her fight. Claire's hands curled into fists at her sides as she stared at the recorder for a long moment. The silence between them felt like it stretched to the edges of the room. Finally, Claire met Joan's eyes again, her expression hardening. "Don't worry, Joan," she said quietly. "We'll get him." The promise in Claire's words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while Joan felt something other than the constant weight of fear. She felt a spark. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps just the quiet reassurance that she had done what needed to be done. The storm was coming, and this time Joan wouldn't be standing alone in its path. As Claire stood to leave, Joan's phone buzzed on the table. Joan glanced down at it. A message from Glenn. "It's time." The house felt smaller now, tighter with the weight of what was coming. Joan moved through it with a careful calm, the routine of each step, a small but steady anchor. Her fingers brushed the spine of the Bible on her shelf, the leather worn from years of touch. She hadn't opened it in months. Not until today. Not until everything had shifted. It was late afternoon, the kind of soft light that came just before dusk, settling low across the furniture. Joan's eyes flicked to the window. Still nothing. Marcus hadn't returned yet, but he would. He always did. The silence felt heavier now that Claire was no longer there. The weight of the plan, the watching, the waiting, the preparation, felt almost too much to carry alone. The doorbell chimed again, and Joan's heart did a quick, fleeting skip. It was Claire. Joan opened the door and Claire walked in without saying much. Her uniform was gone, but the calm confidence that Joan had relied on for years still remained in her eyes. "I brought the camera," Claire said, her voice steady, as though this were a normal visit. She set a small black device down on the kitchen counter. It was no bigger than the palm of her hand. Small, discreet, and exactly what Joan needed. "Where do you want it?" Claire asked, her eyes scanning the room. Joan led her to the bookshelf in the living room, the place where Marcus and Lana always stood when they talked to her. Just close enough to monitor, but far enough to keep their distance. It was perfect. Joan sat down in the chair nearby, watching as Claire worked, her hands moving with precise purpose. The camera nestled beneath a shelf, almost invisible among the dust-covered books. "It's done," Claire said, standing up and dusting off her hands. "You're good to go. It'll catch everything." Joan nodded, though the quiet certainty in her heart had already formed. She was done waiting. Marcus and Lana had been playing games with her for too long. She just needed the right moment to make it all stop. Claire moved toward the door, then stopped. "Here," she said, pulling something from her bag. "Your phone. I've set up a silent alert. If anything happens, if you need help, you just hit the button." She passed Joan the phone, and for the first time, Joan felt like she was holding a weapon. Not just a device for communication. No, this was power. She could make it all stop. Joan turned the phone over in her hands, checking the screen. She'd learned to adapt quickly to technology over the years, even though it had always felt like a second language. But this was survival. "I won't need it," Joan said softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the phone. "But thank you." Claire nodded and stepped toward the door. "Just remember, Joan, you're not alone. He's not the only one who can play these games." Joan watched her go, the quiet footsteps retreating down the hallway. Alone again, but not entirely. Not anymore. The evening came fast, darkness filling the corners of the house like smoke. Joan had already tucked the flash drive inside her Bible, the small device now secure in its new hiding place. She'd learned long ago that trust wasn't something you could give away lightly. The drive was her proof. The only thing that could stop Marcus and Lana from destroying her completely. Joan sat in her chair, waiting for the inevitable. She could hear the house creak in the distance, the soft shuffle of footsteps from upstairs, the sound of Marcus's voice murmuring to Lana. It wouldn't be long now. The door to the kitchen opened, and Marcus stepped inside, his gaze sharp as always. He looked at her, something dark flickering in his eyes. But he didn't speak at first. He only observed, his gaze calculating. Joan didn't flinch. She just watched him, waiting. "You're moving slower these days," Marcus said finally, his voice low, edged with that familiar note of condescension. "You need help, you know." Joan raised an eyebrow. "I've had help. You just don't know it." The words slipped out so calmly, so assuredly. They barely registered as a threat. But she knew better than anyone how much weight they carried. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but it was gone just as quickly as it had come. He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Lana appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes narrowed, scanning the room with a silent suspicion. Joan didn't look up. She didn't need to. They were all playing their parts now. Marcus with his power games, Lana with her quiet judgment. Joan had outlasted them both. The evening dragged on, the house growing colder with every passing minute. Joan's fingers drummed lightly against the arm of her chair. She waited for the moment to come. She wasn't sure when exactly, but it would be soon. She could feel it in the air. Then her phone buzzed, and the world seemed to freeze. A text from Claire. "Got eyes, let him move." The words were simple, almost too simple, but to Joan, they were everything. The plan was in motion. The reckoning was near. Joan stood, her legs stiff but steady. She crossed the room and picked up her Bible, her fingers brushing the edges of the flash drive. The time had come. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for Marcus, not for Lana, and not for anyone else. This was her turn, and she was ready. Joan settled back into the worn armchair, its familiar embrace a small comfort against the unease tightening in her chest. The house was unnervingly quiet. Even the hum of her oxygen machine seemed muted, as if it too sensed the tension hanging in the air. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of her body sink into the chair. It was almost too easy to pretend she was asleep again. She'd done it countless times before, the act so practiced it felt almost natural now. But this time, she was ready for more than just pretending. She was ready for what came next. Her fingers, still steady despite the tension in her limbs, reached for the recorder. She clicked it on with a quiet, deliberate motion. The small device hummed to life, capturing the stillness of the room. The camera Claire had hidden beneath the bookshelf was live, its tiny lens barely visible between the books, watching every movement with impassive accuracy. The clock ticked on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Joan's eyes fluttered open, just a sliver, enough to watch the door, to wait. She could hear Marcus pacing upstairs. His footsteps, slow but deliberate, echoed down the hallway, punctuating the stillness of the house. He was coming. She could feel it. The door creaked open, his shadow falling across the threshold. Joan's breath caught in her chest, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. Marcus stepped into the room, his face set in that familiar mask of controlled anger. His eyes flicked over her for a moment before he approached. His steps measured, calculated. Joan kept her gaze fixed on the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with a feigned, quiet breath. She heard him before she saw him, soft footsteps, the quick hiss of her oxygen line being unplugged, and then, that cold, familiar voice. "One of these nights, Mom," Marcus muttered under his breath. The words felt like ice against her skin. He thought she was asleep. He thought he had the upper hand again. Joan's pulse quickened, but she remained still. Her fingers tight around the recorder, her breathing shallow. Now. She faked a small, labored cough, just enough to break the silence, just enough to startle him. His reaction was immediate, a stutter, a panic. Joan heard his heavy breath as he fumbled with the oxygen line, trying to reconnect it, his hands shaking in the sudden tension. He wasn't expecting her to move. He wasn't expecting her to react. Joan's chest was tight with suppressed breaths, her heart thundering in her ears. He'd done it again. He'd tried again. But this time, she wasn't the one caught off guard. The line hissed back to life, oxygen flooding her lungs as she sucked in a ragged breath. It felt like a victory. But she knew it wasn't over. Marcus froze for a moment, his hand still gripping the oxygen line, his face pale as he realized what he had just done. His gaze flicked toward Joan, who hadn't moved an inch. She watched him with a quiet intensity. She could see the fear flicker in his eyes, fear of being caught, of being exposed. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered under his breath, the words barely above a whisper. His gaze darted toward the corner of the room, where the camera was hidden, its lens capturing everything in silence. Joan didn't move. She let the silence stretch between them, thick with unspoken words. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to do anything. She had already won this round. But then, as though sensing something, Marcus turned sharply and glanced around the room, his suspicion growing. He took a hesitant step backward, eyes narrowing, but still, Joan didn't flinch. She let him think he was still in control. He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Joan alone in the stillness, the recorder still running, capturing every fleeting moment. As soon as the door clicked shut, Joan exhaled slowly, her body finally releasing the tension she'd been holding. Her fingers moved over the recorder, pressing the stop button, sealing the evidence for later. She didn't need to rush now. The game had changed. Claire's voice crackled through Joan's phone, low and tight. "I saw it. He's making his move." Joan didn't respond. She just moved, her feet light and deliberate as she walked over to the small table, retrieving the Bible from the shelf. Her fingers brushed over the hidden flash drive, securing it once more. She wasn't leaving anything to chance. Not now. The door to the kitchen opened again. Joan froze, her hand on the Bible. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't Lana either. The sound of an engine outside, idling just a little too close to her house, sliced through the silence. A patrol car 2 blocks away, its engine softly purring, waiting. Joan's heart skipped. It's happening now. She turned toward the window, her gaze flicking to the street outside. The car wasn't moving. It was waiting for something, waiting for Marcus to make his next move. Joan's phone buzzed again. A new message from Claire. He's leaving. Let's move. Her fingers tightened around the phone. The tension in her chest didn't subside. It hadn't been relieved. This wasn't over. This was only just beginning. Joan stepped back from the window, a slow, measured movement, and sank into the chair again. The Bible in her lap, the flash drive pressed safely beneath the pages. The storm had arrived. And this time, Marcus wouldn't be the one who got away. Joan was in control now. The sound of the knock at the door came just as Joan had anticipated, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the heavy silence of the house. It was a familiar rhythm. Too familiar, in fact, as if the universe was measuring out time, waiting for this moment to unfold. Joan didn't move from her chair, the worn leather of her Bible cool against her palms. Her lungs filled with the steady hiss of oxygen, the faint hum almost comforting. It had become her anchor. She wasn't going anywhere. She sat still, her back straight, hands steady in her lap. The flash drive, her small but formidable weapon, was tucked safely inside her fingers, just a subtle, quiet presence she kept close. Another knock, this one louder, and then the sound of voices, muffled just beyond the door. The officers were here. Joan didn't need to look out the window. She could hear the movement, the scuffling of shoes on the porch. She didn't flinch. She didn't show any sign of surprise. She had been expecting this after all. And now, the game was coming to a close. Her heart beat in a steady rhythm. Calm, controlled. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't anticipation. It was the quiet resolve that had settled deep in her bones, the kind that only came when you knew you had already won. The door creaked open, and Marcus stepped into view, his posture stiff and practiced. His eyes flickered over her, calculating, concern, guilt. But it was all a performance. Joan could see right through it. He stepped forward, a forced, concerned smile twisting his mouth. "Is everything all right, Mom?" His voice had that same false tenderness Joan had heard so many times before. The concern that was always just a little too loud, a little too forced to be real. She didn't answer immediately, just let the silence stretch between them. Then, slowly, she let her gaze shift to the door as Claire stepped in behind the officers, her posture as calm and collected as ever. "We're just checking in," Claire said, her tone professional, but Joan could hear the quiet steel behind it. "A wellness check, Marcus. Mind if we come in?" Marcus's eyes darted toward Joan, then back to Claire, but there was no hesitation in his step as he waved them in. "Of course, it's fine. Everything's fine." Joan didn't move as the officers entered, their shoes light against the hardwood. Lana appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression tight, unreadable. She watched from above, her eyes flicking between the scene in front of her and Joan, as if waiting for something to happen. For a moment she seemed unsure. Joan met her gaze, unwavering, her face a calm mask of control. "I'm sure she's just dramatic sometimes," Lana said, her voice cool but tinged with a sharp edge. Joan's lips barely moved when she spoke. "This is the drama." Lana flinched, but only slightly, as if the words had struck a nerve. Joan held the silence between them, then slowly, deliberately, reached for the Bible. She opened it with the care of someone handling something precious. With a soft rustling of pages, Joan pulled out the flash drive and placed it gently in her hand, the small object a weight of certainty. She handed it to Claire. the cool plastic of the drive slipping into the officer's fingers with a quiet click. Attempted. Audio 1+2, Joan said, her voice steady, almost flat. She didn't need to say more. Everything was there. The truth. The proof. And now, there was no going back for Marcus. Or Lana. Claire nodded silently, her eyes meeting Joan's for a fraction of a second before turning toward the officers. Without a word, the two of them stepped outside with the drive, leaving Marcus and Lana standing in the doorway, their faces stiff with the knowledge that everything they had tried to bury was now on the verge of coming to light. Joan remained where she was, oxygen in place, her fingers drumming lightly on the Bible. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her, but she didn't look up. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy with the weight of the moment. Claire and the officers stepped out onto the porch, and Joan could hear the murmur of their voices just outside. A moment later, she heard the soft hum of the patrol car's engine as it idled, the officers reviewing the evidence. Joan's grip tightened slightly on the Bible, but still, she didn't move. She could hear Marcus behind her now, his voice rising just enough to reach her ears, his words half-formed, a quiet, desperate string of excuses. "She's lying, you know," he said. "She's always been like this. Twisted. She's just trying to ruin everything." Lana didn't speak, but Joan could feel her eyes on her. Joan didn't need to hear their words to know what they were thinking. The game was over, and they knew it. But even now, they were still trying to shift the blame, trying to hide what they had done. Joan exhaled slowly, feeling the quiet fury that had been building inside her finally subside. She was done waiting. The door swung open again, and the officers stepped back inside, their faces unreadable. They didn't need to say anything. Joan could see it in their eyes. "Your son's being arrested," Claire said, her voice low but clear, "for attempted murder, elder abuse, and whatever else we find on that drive." Joan didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She only nodded once, as if the decision had already been made long before they arrived. The officers turned toward Marcus, and for the first time, Joan saw something flicker in his eyes, a spark of realization that there was no escape this time. As they led him out of the house, Marcus shot one last venomous glance toward Joan. But Joan didn't look away. She was finished with looking back. Lana followed them, her shoulders stiff as she moved past Joan. She didn't speak either, but the silence between them was enough. Joan sat back, the hum of the oxygen machine filling the room once again, a steady rhythm that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And for the first time in a long while, Joan felt something she hadn't known she was missing. Peace. The air outside had grown thick with the weight of the moment, the kind of oppressive stillness that precedes a storm. Joan remained in her chair, the rhythmic hum of the oxygen machine the only sound in the room, a steady pulse that anchored her to this moment. The flash drive was still in her hand, a cool and quiet reminder of the power she now held. Marcus was being arrested. Joan didn't need to watch the officers move through the house. She didn't need to see the struggle in his eyes, the way he probably wanted to lash out, to deny it all. She could hear it in his voice already, shaky, desperate, and small. Not this time, she thought. The last of his control was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Claire and the officers moved toward Marcus now, their presence like a slow, methodical force closing in. Joan didn't have to look up as they entered the room again. She knew what was happening. She could feel it, even without the visual. The sounds of heavy footsteps and shifting bodies filled the air. Claire's voice broke the silence, calm, professional. "Marcus Huxley, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your mother, Joan Huxley. You have the right to remain silent." She continued, the words flowing with practiced ease. But the weight of them was undeniable. Marcus froze, For a moment, there was a chilling, almost absurd silence. He stood completely still, like a statue, his eyes wide, lips parted as if trying to comprehend what was happening. Then the tension broke with a bitter laugh. Seriously? His voice was raw, laced with disbelief, but there was something else there too. A sharp edge of panic. This is a joke, right? Joan could feel his gaze on her, but she didn't respond, didn't even look up from her lap. She didn't need to speak. The truth was already out there. In the recordings, in the police reports. She had already said everything that needed to be said. Claire didn't flinch. Her voice remained level, unwavering. You can laugh, Marcus, but it doesn't change anything. 2 recordings. Witness tampering. Vulnerable adult endangerment. Her words cut through the room, each one landing with the sharp precision of a weapon. For a moment, Marcus's jaw clenched. He took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, then the window, as if trying to figure out how to escape. But it was already too late. The officers were closing in. Lana, who had been standing silently near the door, her posture stiff and unreadable, stepped forward. She reached out toward Marcus, her hands trembling just slightly, her voice rising in a panicked plea. This is a misunderstanding. It's all a mistake. You don't have to do this. Her words spilled out in a rush, her tone desperate like someone trying to salvage a sinking ship. Joan's lips curved into a cold, thin smile. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room. This isn't a misunderstanding, Lana. This is the truth. She didn't look at her, didn't even acknowledge her presence. She simply let the words hang in the air, sharp and unyielding. Marcus's eyes flicked between Lana and Joan, a flicker of something breaking through the facade. She's always hated me, he muttered, the words more bitter than anything else. Joan's eyes finally lifted to meet his, the calm in her gaze a stark contrast to the chaos around them. I forgave you too long, she said, her voice steady, as if the years of suffering had finally led to this singular, unshakable truth. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of her words settling over him. He was realizing at last that he couldn't escape this. The law was closing in, and there was no way out. Outside, Joan could hear the sounds of the neighborhood beginning to stir. The subtle shuffle of curtains being pulled back, the quiet rustle of blinds as curious neighbors peeked out from behind their windows. Word was spreading. The quiet, peaceful neighborhood was suddenly alive with whispers. Joan could feel the eyes on her, though she didn't care. She had nothing to hide. This was her moment. Marcus was no longer in control, no longer the puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. The truth was finally out, and it would speak for her now. As the officers began to cuff Marcus, the silence in the room stretched longer, broken only by the faint rustling of fabric, the quiet mutterings of disbelief from Lana. Joan remained still, watching the scene unfold with the same quiet resolve. But then, as Marcus was led toward the door, his hands cuffed behind his back, something shifted. He stopped, just for a moment, his body tense with rage. He glanced back over his shoulder, eyes wild, and for a brief moment, Joan could see the mask crack, the vulnerability beneath all the years of bitterness. I never wanted this, Marcus muttered, his voice raw with a mixture of anger and regret. But it wasn't an apology. It was just a last, desperate attempt to make sense of everything. Joan's gaze never wavered as she watched him. You should have thought of that before, she said, her words quiet, but the weight of them hung in the air. Marcus, now fully aware that there was no escape, finally gave up. The officers led him outside, and Lana followed, her face pale and tight with the tension of it all. Joan didn't watch them go. She didn't need to. The house fell silent again, the only sound the soft hum of her oxygen machine, She let the stillness envelop her, the quiet satisfaction settling into her bones. And then, just as the officers began to drive away, Joan's phone buzzed once more. A single message from Claire. "It's over. You won." For the first time in a long while, Joan allowed herself to close her eyes. She had won. The house was empty now. The silence felt different somehow. Heavier. It was as though the walls, still clinging to the remnants of Marcus's presence, had taken a deep breath and exhaled with relief. Joan moved through the room slowly, methodically, her every step measured. There were things to do, things she needed to leave behind, and others she needed to take with her. Glenn was already there, his movements swift but gentle as he helped Joan pack. 2 bags. Nothing too large, just enough to carry what was essential. The rest of it would be left behind. The home she had clung to for so long, the one she had tried to protect, was now a place too full of ghosts for her to stay. The recorder was the first item she placed into the bag, the small device that had started it all. The one piece of evidence that had shattered Marcus's world, had set everything in motion. Glenn moved quietly around the room, folding clothes, gathering what little Joan had left to her. His hands were steady as he moved from one pile to the next, but Joan could see the hesitation in his eyes. He had always been there, always willing to help. But this was different. There was a kind of finality in the air now. They both knew it. "Ready?" he asked quietly as he zipped up the second bag. Joan nodded, her throat tight. It had to be done. She couldn't stay here, not after everything. Not with the memories of Marcus's betrayal, the years of whispered malice lingering in the corners of every room. She stepped into the hallway, looking at the house one last time. The worn rugs, the dust settling on the edges of the furniture. It was all too much now. The place had been filled with so many lies, so many attempts to control her. They walked past the family photo albums stacked on the table, and Joan's fingers lingered over the last album. It was an old one, yellowing at the edges. She hesitated, then opened it. She flipped through the pages until she reached the last one. A picture of a much younger Marcus, smiling, his arm draped over her shoulder, before everything fell apart. Joan closed the album with a quiet snap, leaving it behind on the table as she made her way to the door. She didn't need to take anything else with her. This was it. The beginning of a new chapter. And she wasn't about to look back. The car ride was long and quiet, the air thick with unsaid words. Glenn kept his eyes on the road, the town growing smaller as they moved farther from the life Joan had known. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, the bag resting at her feet. There was a strange comfort in the drive, as if the distance was peeling away the last remnants of the life she had been forced to leave behind. They arrived at Glenn's sister's house just as the sun began to dip behind the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. It felt like the kind of place where no one would ask questions, where no one would remember the woman who had lived in the house with the secrets. Joan stepped out of the car, the weight of the day settling into her bones. The guest room was simple, but it would be enough. Glenn helped her settle in, placing the bag on the bed and pulling the curtains open just a fraction to let in the evening light. Joan didn't need much. She'd learned long ago that comfort wasn't a luxury she could afford. But this place felt safe, quiet. Glenn left her alone for a moment, and as she sat down on the edge of the bed, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out slowly, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Lana. "How could you do this to your own son?" Joan's fingers tightened around the phone, her throat constricting. The words stung, but she didn't let them show. Not anymore. She tapped the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys as she thought about what to say. Then, instead of typing, she pressed the voice message button. Her breath was shaky as she recorded the message. She coughed, the sound sharp and harsh, then fell into a long silence. It was a small, quiet act of defiance, one last attempt to show Lana how far she had come. The message was nothing but that cough, ragged, forced, and raw. She hit send and set the phone down on the bedside table. There was nothing left to say. An hour later, as Joan sat in the guest room, the world outside settling into its evening rhythm, her phone buzzed again. It was Claire. "Protection order filed. He's not coming near you again." Joan closed her eyes, the weight of the words sinking in. She had taken the first step toward safety, toward freedom. But even as the relief washed over her, a small, dark thought lingered. Marcus's arrest had been only the beginning. The battle was far from over. She stood up, walking to the window and gazing out at the quiet street. The stillness felt almost too peaceful. Joan wasn't used to it. It was as if the calm before the storm was waiting just beyond the horizon. For the first time in a long while, Joan allowed herself to exhale. She was free, yes, but she wasn't done yet. The next steps were hers to take. And this time, she would make sure they counted. The world outside Joan's window was quiet, too quiet. She hadn't expected peace to feel like this. But the silence that had once been oppressive was now something else entirely. It was the calm after the storm, the deep exhale of a battle fought and won. But Joan knew better than to believe the storm was over. She had only just begun to secure her future, and she would not let her guard down. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Barry, a family lawyer whom Joan had known for years, was the one to finalize her power of attorney and medical proxy. He had always been a trusted friend, and now he was standing by her side, helping her protect what was left of her dignity. Barry had taken all the necessary steps, ensuring Joan's medical decisions would be in the hands of someone she trusted, someone who could protect her from Marcus's manipulations. Glenn had been named in her proxy. Joan didn't hesitate. He had been there when no one else had, steady and unwavering, even when Marcus had tried to break her. But it was more than just legal documents. Joan had to ensure that, even in the darkest of times, her wishes would be honored. She wasn't taking any chances. The morning after the paperwork was finalized, a letter arrived. It was a thick, official-looking envelope, and as Joan opened it, she saw the words "cease and desist" in bold, legal lettering. It was from Marcus's lawyer, demanding she not discuss his actions with anyone, threatening legal retaliation if she pressed charges further. Lana's name was at the bottom, her signature clear. The irony of the letter almost made Joan smile. Lana, the woman who had never truly been an ally, was now trying to protect Marcus from the very consequences of his actions. Joan sat in the kitchen, reading it over and over again, as if the words might somehow change or lose their sting. But they didn't. They were exactly what she expected. She folded the letter slowly, her fingers still steady. There would be no negotiating, no pleading for forgiveness. The law was speaking now, and it would speak louder than Lana ever could. Claire called later that day with news Joan had been expecting but had almost not allowed herself to anticipate. "We've filed formal charges," Claire said, her voice steady, but Joan could hear the edge of satisfaction in it. "Attempted homicide, elder abuse, obstruction, everything's moving forward. He can't hide from this anymore." Joan leaned back in her chair, allowing the words to sink in. The charges were everything she needed to hear, everything she had hoped for. Marcus's game was over, and now there would be no more running, no more hiding behind lies. Joan didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Claire knew that her work was just beginning, but for Joan, this was the end of a long and painful chapter. "Thank you," Joan finally said, her voice soft but resolute. "This is more than I could have asked for." Later that week, a news station reached out for an interview. They wanted her side of the story, wanted to air the truth to the world. They said it would be her moment to speak up, to finally let the world know what had happened behind the walls of that house. Joan didn't even hesitate. "No," she said, when the reporter's name appeared on the phone. "Let the law speak. That's all anyone needs to hear." The truth didn't need to be packaged and paraded. It had already been laid bare in the courtroom, in the police reports, in the recordings that would be played in the legal system, not the media. Joan had done what she needed to do. She didn't need the spotlight. Glenn arrived later that evening, a small safe in his hands. It was simple, nothing extravagant, but it would serve its purpose. He installed it under the bed, right where Joan could reach it easily. The small, secure metal box would be her final safeguard, a place to store what mattered most: the truth, the evidence, everything she had fought for. Joan didn't say much as Glenn worked, but her hands trembled slightly as she approached the bed. She placed the flash drive inside, the evidence of Marcus's cruelty now protected in a place where it could not be ignored. She added one more item: a sealed letter. It was simple, but important. She held the envelope for a moment before slipping it inside the safe with the flash drive, sealing the door with a satisfying click. The letter was titled, "In Case I Don't Wake Up." It wasn't a letter of resignation. It wasn't a letter of surrender. It was a letter of closure, a final statement of her journey. Joan had lived through this nightmare, and now, even if something were to happen to her, the world would know the truth. It would not die with her. That night, after everything was in place, Joan lay in bed, the hum of her oxygen machine lulling her into a kind of quiet peace. She didn't know what the future would hold. There were still battles to be fought, still legal wrangling to come, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a true sense of control. She had done everything she could. The storm had passed. The silence was finally hers to keep. But as she closed her eyes, a small part of her wondered what would come next. What kind of world would she wake up to in the morning? Would Marcus still be out there, trying to escape the consequences of his actions? She didn't know, but she would be ready for whatever came. This time, she wouldn't let him take anything more from her. Joan sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The house was still, too still, the kind of quiet that spoke of change, of the finality that was slowly creeping into her life. The air was thick with it, the weight of decisions made, of things left behind, and now the choice that would shape the rest of her life was waiting for her. Barry, her lawyer, sat across from her, the file between them heavy with meaning. His face was kind, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. Marcus's lawyer had made an offer, a plea deal, reduced charges, probation, therapy. It seemed like an easy out for Marcus, a way to avoid the full consequences of his actions. Joan felt the weight of the offer, the temptation in it. On the surface, it seemed like a solution. No trial, no further exposure. Just an end to the years of pain, the months of watching Marcus twist her world around. But there was a price, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to pay it. "He's still trying to manipulate his way out," Barry said, his voice firm. "This isn't justice. It's a bargain to avoid the consequences." Joan's fingers brushed the edge of her cup, the ceramic cold beneath her fingertips. Her mind raced through the options. She could take the deal. It would give her peace, wouldn't it? A way to end the legal battle. Avoid the possibility of Marcus trying to drag her back into his life. But then, what would that mean for the truth? What would it mean for the power she had worked so hard to gain over the past months? She looked up at Barry, her gaze steady. "What happens if I refuse?" Barry's face softened slightly. "If you refuse, the trial continues. It's messy. It will drag out longer than you want, Joan. The public will hear things you don't want them to hear. There will be scrutiny." Joan's thoughts flickered back to the recordings. the evidence she had so carefully protected. There was nothing more to hide. Not anymore. She had already lived through the worst of it. The thought of Marcus coming back into her life, manipulating the system, made her blood run cold. But she also knew something else. She had already been through enough. She had fought for so long, but she wasn't about to let this consume her any longer. "I don't want him near me," Joan said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was no mistaking the resolve in it. "But I don't need him buried either." Barry nodded, his expression understanding. He knew that Joan wasn't just speaking about Marcus's fate. She was speaking about herself, about her own peace of mind, her own closure. She didn't need to see him destroyed, but she needed him gone, out of her life, once and for all. "I'll let them know," Barry said, closing the file with a quiet click. "But it's your decision, Joan. You control the next move, fully." That evening, Joan sat alone in the guest room, the room still, save for the soft hum of the oxygen machine. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing in on her thoughts as she reached for the recorder once more. She needed to hear it one last time. The evidence, the truth, the sound of Marcus's whispered threats. It was something she couldn't undo, something that had been etched into her mind and heart. But now, she needed to make sure it didn't control her any longer. With a steady hand, she placed the recorder on the bed beside her, hitting the play button. The sound of her own breath came through first, the sharp, desperate gasps from that night, followed by Marcus's voice. Cold, casual, the words chilling in their malice. "Last breath, Mom." She closed her eyes as the recording played on, the feeling of it wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. It was too real, too vivid. She let it play until the end, until the last desperate breath of her own voice was swallowed by the silence. It was done. It was over. But now, she had to choose how to live with it. Joan paused the recorder and sat in the quiet that followed, her heart beating steadily in her chest. The silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of fear, of being trapped. It was the silence of survival. The next morning, Joan stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She was still the same woman, but the years of suffering, the weight of what she'd endured, had reshaped her. She wasn't broken. She was solid now, steady, ready. When Barry called later, she was prepared. "I'll take the plea," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "With the conditions, permanent no contact and the registered caregiver restriction, but only that. No more leniency. He needs to understand that he can't come back into my life." Barry's approval came through immediately. "I'll make it clear. It's done, Joan." As she hung up the phone, Joan felt a strange peace settle over her. It wasn't victory. It wasn't a finish line. But it was the next step. The one that would keep her safe. The one that would ensure Marcus could never hurt her again. Joan sat back in her chair, the weight of everything she had fought for finally beginning to sink in. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had survived. And now, she was free. But as the minutes passed, the calm she had found began to feel fragile, as though something was waiting just beyond the horizon, something she couldn't quite see. And in that silence, Joan wondered if she would ever truly be free of the shadow Marcus had cast over her life. Joan's heart drummed quietly in her chest as the elevator ascended. The sterile walls of the courthouse seemed to close in on her, the hum of the mechanical gears overhead louder than the footsteps of the officers beside her. Her hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair, knuckles white, as though anchoring her to the ground. The oxygen mask sat comfortably over her face, the steady hiss of the machine an unspoken reminder that her life still hung by a thread, one that Marcus had nearly severed. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, and unbroken. The courtroom loomed ahead, its doors heavy, imposing. They opened with a quiet creak as she was wheeled inside. The room was stark in its formality. The polished wood of the benches, the rows of empty seats, the heavy, oppressive silence that filled the air like a tension waiting to snap. Joan didn't feel the weight of it. Not now. Not when she knew the truth would be laid bare for all to see. Marcus was already seated at the defendant's table, slouched in his chair as if trying to shrink into the shadows. His lips were tight, jaw clenched, eyes darting nervously between the judge and the room around him. There was no trace of the arrogance he'd once carried so freely. The mask of control was gone now, replaced with a quiet desperation. The officers positioned Joan's wheelchair in front of the judge's bench. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in every detail, the way the courtroom seemed to pull away from her, as if she were a ghost among the living. Yet the weight of her presence couldn't be ignored. The judge, a woman whose face seemed carved from stone, glanced briefly at Joan before looking at the court reporter. "We will proceed with the presentation of the evidence," she said in a voice that seemed to echo through the room. Her gavel tapped once, sharply, as the silence thickened again. Joan's eyes never wavered as the prosecutor stepped forward, a man she had met briefly but trusted completely. He didn't waste time, going straight to the heart of the matter. With a quiet nod from the judge, he pressed play on the audio recorder, and the room fell into a deathly hush. The voice came through the speakers, crackling but unmistakable. "Last breath, Mom." Joan heard it as clearly as the first time, the words she'd fought so hard to block out. The sound of Marcus's voice, so cold, so calculated, brought with it the weight of everything she had endured. But she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She sat there, oxygen mask firmly in place. Her expression still, unwavering. This was the moment she had waited for. The moment Marcus could no longer run from what he had done. The gasps from the gallery came quickly, as they always did when they heard the recording for the first time. Whispers rippled through the room. Joan's eyes, calm and steady, moved from the judge to Marcus, watching as his face tightened, his body growing more rigid. She could feel the change in him, the crack in the facade he had tried so hard to maintain. The prosecutor stepped back, allowing the weight of the evidence to sink in. Marcus sat frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly, though he made no attempt to speak. His lawyer leaned in, whispering in his ear, but he didn't react. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice as cold as the stone bench before her. "Mr. Huxley, do you have anything to say before we proceed with sentencing?" Marcus's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. I regret my actions," he muttered, his words coming out in a jumbled rush, the weight of his regret too little, too late. He didn't look at Joan as he spoke, his eyes fixed on his hands in his lap, like a child caught doing something wrong. Joan didn't move, didn't react to his words. She didn't need to. She had already heard the truth. She had already seen the man he was, and had always been. His regret was just another mask, another attempt to manipulate the narrative. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low but sharp. "And I remember mine." Her words rang through the courtroom, echoing off the cold, polished walls. They were simple, direct, and final. There was no room for forgiveness anymore. No space for more manipulation. It was over. Marcus had made his bed, and now he would have to lie in it. The room fell into a deep silence after that, the weight of Joan's words hanging in the air, almost tangible. She felt the eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with sympathy, but she didn't need to see them. She had spoken her truth, and the world was forced to hear it. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lips pressing together into a thin line. There was nothing more he could say, nothing more he could do to save himself. He was trapped in the reality Joan had created. The judge's gavel struck once more, its echo sharp and final. "We will proceed with sentencing at the next hearing." Joan didn't wait for the room to clear. She didn't wait for Marcus to be led away in cuffs. She simply turned her head and glanced toward the back of the courtroom. Her eyes met Claire's for a brief, meaningful moment. The corners of her lips twitched just slightly, the smallest of smiles playing at the edges of her mouth. It was done. And for the first time in a long time, Joan felt the weight of her freedom settling around her shoulders. There was still more to come, more to fight. But for now, this moment was hers. The fight for her life, for her peace, had been won. The room began to empty, the chatter of voices rising around her, but Joan remained still in her chair, the quiet hum of her oxygen machine filling the space where the storm had once been. The silence now was hers to own. She had taken back her life, and no one, not even Marcus, could take it away again. The months passed quietly after the trial, their steady rhythm marked by the hum of Joan's oxygen machine and the soft sounds of the life she was slowly reclaiming. Marcus had entered the court-ordered program, and with it, his life had narrowed to a small, controlled existence. He was barred from her home, her hospital visits, her assets. He had lost everything in the wake of his actions, and Joan felt no satisfaction in that. It wasn't victory. It was simply the way things had to be. Lana, too, had faded from Joan's life. The dissolution of her marriage was inevitable, though unspoken. The house that had once been shared between them had emptied out, the silence becoming final as Lana moved away. Joan heard no news of her, nothing about the life she had built on lies. Joan didn't need to know. Joan had no desire to rush back into the life she had once known. Instead, she focused on herself, on healing what had been broken inside her. Every morning she rose early, the routine now familiar, though still difficult. She had always been strong, but now, strength took on a new meaning. It was more than enduring. It was living again. She began pulmonary rehabilitation 3 times a week. At first, it was a struggle. The walking, the shortness of breath, the constant fight to keep her body moving forward. It reminded her too much of the past. The slow, careful movement she had learned during those long, painful years with Marcus. But each session became easier, her steps a little longer, her breath a little steadier. Glenn, ever steady, had been there from the start. He helped Joan rebuild what had been lost, piece by piece, even in the smallest ways. One morning, he showed up with the materials for a garden, wooden planks, soil, a collection of bright, hardy plants. "You survived," he said, his tone matter of fact, as he bent to lay out the framework for a raised bed in the backyard. "Might as well grow something." Joan watched him work. The simplicity of it strange but satisfying. He wasn't just building a garden, he was offering something more, a way forward. A symbol that, even in the face of everything she had been through, she could still nurture life. The garden bloomed in fits and starts. The plants grew stronger each day, just as Joan did. She would sit outside in the morning sun, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the flowers unfurl, the small green leaves stretching toward the light. It was the one place she allowed herself to relax fully. Everything else had been about survival, but here, in the soft dirt and steady growth, there was peace. She started a binder, a thick, well-organized collection of everything she had protected. The recordings, the letters, the documents. All the pieces that made up the story of what had happened to her and what she had refused to let define her. It was a quiet reminder of her power, a record of everything she had endured and overcome. Joan wasn't sure who would ever read it, but it didn't matter. She needed it, for herself, as a tangible proof that she had won. The The title on the cover of the binder was simple: What I Protected. Claire visited occasionally. Their friendship, forged in the slow, steady process of exposing Marcus's cruelty, had deepened into something that felt like family. Joan wasn't used to such closeness, but it was there, in the way Claire spoke to her, in the moments they shared over coffee, in the way Claire's gaze never wavered when she spoke of Marcus's trial. "Still breathing?" Claire asked one day, her smile light but knowing. Joan, glancing up from her garden, gave the smallest of smiles in return. "Spite keeps the lungs open," she said, the words light, but beneath them was something deeper, something Joan had learned in the years of fighting for her life. It wasn't anger that kept her going. It was the refusal to let anyone, even Marcus, steal another moment from her. Claire chuckled softly, but Joan could see the warmth in her eyes. She knew. The quiet strength Joan carried, the way she had rebuilt her life from the wreckage. No one could take that away. Not anymore. The months turned into years. Time moved forward, slow and steady, like the plants in Joan's garden. Every step she took, every breath, was another reclaiming of herself. And while the past would always remain a part of her, it no longer defined her. She was living now, not just surviving. But as Joan looked out at her garden one evening, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the flowers, a strange unease stirred within her. There was something unsettled in the stillness, something just beyond her reach. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't Lana. It was something else. Something new. Joan couldn't put a name to it, but it was there, a whisper in the silence. Something that would come for her, no matter how much she had rebuilt, and she would be ready. Because in this new chapter of her life, nothing, no one, would take away the peace she had fought so hard to find. The next fight was still waiting, and she would face it, just as she had faced everything before, head on, with unwavering strength. It came in the middle of the afternoon. A letter slid through the gap in the door, a thin envelope with her name written in neat, careful handwriting. Joan stood in the quiet of her kitchen, the soft rustling of the wind outside the window filling the silence. For a moment she simply stared at the envelope, as though it held something larger than its contents. It had been years since Layla's name had appeared in her life. The last time she had seen her granddaughter was before the storm, with Marcus had fully unraveled, before the lies and the years of manipulation had consumed the family. Layla had been young then, still in her teens, unaware of the dark currents pulling at their family's edges. Joan unfolded the letter slowly, the edges of the paper creased with age. "I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Can I see you?" The words were simple, unadorned, but they struck Joan like a sudden gust of wind. Layla had been distant for so long, wrapped up in her own life, her own battles. For her to reach out now, it stirred something in Joan. Was it guilt? A sense of hope? Or was it just the inevitability of something unfinished, something that had always hovered just out of reach? Joan set the letter down, her fingers lingering over the edges. She thought of the years Layla had spent away from her, of the silence, the absence. Yet here was this letter, a bridge, a chance for something new to begin. She picked up her pen and began to write her response. "If you come with truth, my door is open." She set the pen down, the words final. Like a small door opening into the unknown. Truth. That was all she had ever asked for, and it was the only thing that could bridge the distance between them now. A week later, Layla arrived at the front door, tentative and quiet. She was older now, her face carrying the weight of the years she had lived without Joan. Her eyes were softer than Joan remembered, less guarded, but there was still that careful distance in the way she held herself. The child she had been was gone, replaced by a young woman who had experienced the world in ways Joan hadn't been part of. Joan stood in the doorway, her hand still on the knob. They both hesitated for a long moment. Then, Layla spoke. "Can I come in?" Joan nodded, stepping aside. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Joan didn't feel the need to rush. They had time now. Inside, Layla sat in the same chair Joan had spent so many quiet hours in, her hands folded in her lap. They both seemed unsure how to begin, as if they were strangers trying to find the thread that had once connected them. Joan moved to the kitchen, preparing 2 cups of tea, the warm steam rising between them as she set them down on the table. "I don't know how to start," Layla said after a long silence, her voice soft but steady. Joan sat across from her, the warmth of the tea seeping into her fingers. "You've already started?" she replied simply. "You came." Layla looked at her, her gaze flickering toward the small garden outside the window, then back to Joan. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I wasn't there for you. I didn't understand what was happening." Joan set her cup down, watching Layla closely. "You were young. You couldn't have known." "But I should have known," Layla said, her voice breaking slightly. "I should have seen how wrong everything was, how much he was hurting you." Joan leaned back in her chair, her breath slow and measured. She could feel the years of pain, the bitterness that had once clouded her heart, slowly dissolving in the quiet presence of Layla's words. The truth was out now. And for the first time, Joan felt something like a weight lifting. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easier than Joan had expected. They talked about Marcus, about what he had done to them, about the things that had been left unsaid. But they also spoke of the world beyond all of that. The life Layla had built, the future she wanted for herself. It felt like a beginning. As the evening light began to fade, Layla stood up, moving toward the door. Her footsteps were hesitant, but she turned to Joan before leaving. "I don't know what to do with everything I've learned," she said quietly. "But I'll try. I'll try to do better." Joan smiled faintly. "That's all any of us can do. Try." Layla hesitated at the door. Can I see the garden sometime?" Joan nodded. "It's yours too." The next morning, Layla returned, and they spent the day together in the garden. Layla had always loved the flowers, the colors, the life that could grow from the earth. It was a small, simple way to begin to rebuild the bridge between them. It wasn't about the past, or even the present. It was about something new. Something that had yet to be fully formed. As they worked side by side, Joan's thoughts drifted back to the safe beneath her bed, where the flash drive and the letter she had written to herself still sat hidden. They were a reminder of the strength it had taken to survive. But now, there was something else. Something she hadn't counted on. A new chapter was beginning. One that included Layla. A new kind of peace. Still fragile but growing. Later that day, as they sat in the garden, Layla asked, "What's in the safe?" Joan looked at her, the weight of the question hanging in the air. She hesitated for only a moment before responding. "Everything I needed to stay alive," Joan said. "And now it's yours too." Layla's eyes searched her grandmother's face. "What will you do with it?" Joan's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. "Depends who knocks next," she replied, her voice steady. The air felt heavier in that moment, as if something else was coming, a new challenge, a new chapter. But Joan was ready for it, with Layla by her side, the garden growing at her feet, and the future wide open. It was hers to shape, and she would protect it, no matter what. Joan sat in the quiet of her living room, the steady hum of the oxygen machine her only companion. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor, but there was something different about this light. It wasn't the kind of light she had seen before. It was softer, more forgiving, like the final chapters of a book that had long been overdue. And for the first time in a long time, Joan felt as though she was ready to write the ending herself. Her fingers hovered over the video recorder. She had thought about this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, it didn't seem as easy as she had imagined. There were so many words, so much history to condense into a few minutes, and yet, it felt like the most important story she would ever tell. She cleared her throat and pressed record. "Hi," she began, her voice steady, but with a quiet strength that came from years of surviving. "I'm Joan Huxley, and this is my story. What happened, what didn't kill me, and what I did next." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had fought through. The years of abuse, the silence she had endured, and the life she had clawed back from the edge of despair. She paused for a moment, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in, before continuing. "This is the truth. The truth about what it means to survive, to fight for yourself when no one else will. I was broken, but I never stopped breathing. I never stopped moving forward." She looked down at her hands, the steady rise and fall of her chest as she took a slow breath. The next words felt heavier, but she spoke them anyway. "The recordings you'll hear, the ones that saved my life, are all that's left. I've lived through them, and now I'm living past them. Marcus is gone from my life, and for the first time in a long time, I can breathe. I can live." Joan's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the folder beside her. Inside were the documents she had spent years organizing, the evidence of her survival. The flash drive, the legal papers, the letters. Everything that had been part of her fight was there, stored safely in one place. "I'm not a victim," she continued, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not someone who waits to be saved. I did what I had to do, and now, it's time to let the world hear the truth." She exhaled deeply, as though releasing the weight of years from her chest, before adding, "This is the story I wanted to tell." Joan sat back for a moment, letting the silence envelop her. Her eyes flickered to the family photo album sitting on the table, the one she had left behind in her old house. The memories were still there, but they no longer defined her. They were pieces of the past, and now she was free to move on. "Now I'm sharing this with you. Claire, Barry, Layla, Glenn, all of you who have been part of this journey, part of what I've fought for. This is for you. You've helped me rebuild my life, and I will never forget that." She hit pause on the recorder for a moment, taking a deep breath. There was still one more thing she needed to say. "This video," she continued, her voice steady, "is called Last Breath, Withholding, and I'm sending it to those who need to hear it. For those who can't speak. For those who don't have a voice. For all the survivors out there." She paused again, looking directly at the camera. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer here. And I want you to know, I lived. I fought. And I kept breathing, even when everything around me told me to stop." She exhaled slowly and looked at the screen, her gaze unwavering. "This is my legacy. This is my truth." Joan stopped the recording and leaned back in her chair, her breath steady, the room still. She glanced over at the safe under her bed, where the flash drive would soon be tucked away for the last time, hidden but never forgotten. Later that day, she sent the video to Claire, Barry, Layla, and Glenn. Each one had a part in her journey, and each one had helped her reclaim the pieces of herself that Marcus had tried so hard to tear apart. She didn't need to say anything else. The video spoke for her now. A few days later, Claire called. Her voice, though kind, had a serious undertone. "This should be required in every academy," Claire said, her words punctuated by a quiet sigh. "What you've done, Joan, it's not just about survival. It's about showing the world what it means to fight back. To live again." Joan didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Claire had always understood her, always known exactly what Joan needed to hear. She just listened, letting the words settle in the space between them. "I'm proud of you, Joan," Claire said softly. Joan smiled to herself, the weight of the past finally slipping away. She was proud of herself too, proud of the woman she had become, of the fight she had fought. And now, for the first time, she felt ready for what was next. As the sun began to set that evening, Joan felt the familiar hum of peace settle around her. She looked out the window at the small garden she had planted with Glenn's help, the flowers stretching toward the fading light. The garden was a symbol of everything she had fought for: life, growth, and a future she had built with her own hands. But even as she sat there, something stirred in the air. A new whisper of change, something she hadn't anticipated but knew was coming. Joan wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because she was ready for whatever came next. And this time, nothing would take her peace away again. The evening light filtered softly through the window, casting warm, fading hues across the room. Joan sat at her desk, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders like a familiar companion. The recorder, the letters, the binder, all of it had been sent out into the world. She had done what she needed to do. But there was one final piece left to complete. With careful hands, Joan picked up the sealed letter, the one she had written months ago. A final message to herself. A reminder of her journey, of everything she had survived. She looked at it one last time, the paper worn from her fingers tracing its edges, and stood slowly from her chair. There was a quiet finality in the way she moved. No more lingering, no more looking back. She had lived with this for long enough. The letter had served its purpose. It had kept her grounded during the dark nights, during the moments when she had wondered if it would ever be over. But now it was time to let it go. Time to burn it. To truly sever the last tie to the past. Joan walked over to the fireplace, the room now bathed in the deep, warm glow of the setting sun. The fire was already crackling softly, the embers glowing with life. She placed the letter in the flames, watching as it curled and blackened, the words disappearing in the heat. Her breath was slow, steady. There was no hesitation in her movements. She didn't look back. She wasn't afraid. The last tie to Marcus, to that old life, was gone. She lit a match and dropped it onto the paper. The letter caught fire quickly, the flames licking at the edges until all that remained was ash. Joan took a deep breath, watching the smoke curl upwards, rising into the air. The past was finished. She had kept her breath, her will, her life. And now it was time to step forward, free from the chains that had bound her. Joan returned to her desk, sitting slowly, her fingers tapping lightly on the wooden surface as she let the silence fill the space. Her mind was clear, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. It had taken years, but she had arrived at this moment on her own terms. The phone buzzed on the desk, pulling Joan from her thoughts. She glanced down, seeing Layla's name on the screen. Her heart gave a small, quiet flutter of warmth. She pressed accept and brought the phone to her ear. "Grandma!" Layla's voice came through, light with excitement. "I got the internship. You were right about me. I'm in." Joan smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had known. She had always known Layla would rise above the past, would find her own path. "I'm proud of you," Joan said simply. "You're doing exactly what I always knew you could." Layla laughed, the sound a pure, bright note in the quiet room. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. You've shown me what it means to fight, to live. I'm doing it for us, for both of us." Joan's smile deepened, but it was soft, quiet. "You don't need to do it for me. You're doing it for yourself. That's all that matters now." Layla's voice softened. "I know. but still. I want to make you proud. Joan didn't answer right away, simply letting the silence settle between them. There was so much Layla had to offer, so much still to come. The world was wide open for her now. Glenn stepped into the room holding a tray with 2 mugs of coffee. He set it down gently on the table, his movements slow but deliberate, as if making sure the moment wasn't disturbed. He sat down beside Joan, his eyes meeting hers, and for a long moment they shared the same quiet understanding. "You're still breathing, Joan," Glenn said softly, offering her a mug. Joan took the coffee, her hands steady, and sipped it slowly. The warmth of the drink spread through her, but it wasn't just the coffee. It was everything she had built. The garden, the new life with Layla, the quiet strength that had grown in her over the years. "Another good day?" Glenn asked, his voice light but with a tenderness that Joan appreciated more than words could express. "Everyone I choose," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a certain quiet power behind it. She had made her choice. Every day was a choice now. And she was choosing herself. They sat there together for a while, the soft hum of the evening filling the room. The house had been empty for so long, but now it felt full of possibility, full of peace. Joan's gaze flickered to the small safe under her bed. She knew what it held: the flash drive, the records, the truth that she had kept locked away. But it wasn't just the physical evidence of survival. It was the strength she had found to live again, to reclaim her peace. A photo sat on her desk, tucked in the corner. A photo of Claire, Glenn, and Layla. It had been taken on a warm summer day, the 3 of them standing together in the garden, a snapshot of a family rebuilt. The label beneath it read, "Family is who helps you breathe." The words were simple, but they rang true. Family wasn't just blood. It was the people who helped you stay alive, who helped you grow, who never let you go. Joan's family had always been there, and now they were whole again. Joan leaned back in her chair, the fire still crackling softly in the background. She had survived, and in doing so, she had found something even more precious: peace. Her son unplugged her oxygen, whispering "last breath" as his final act of control. But in the end, she had called the police with the recording. And in doing so, she had started a brand new chapter. This time, she would write the ending herself.